There is a specific kind of pain that doesn't come from failure. It doesn't come from loss or hardship or the ordinary suffering of life. It comes from something far more corrosive. And that is the moment you realize you have been tolerating things you should have never allowed. The moment you look back and see, with terrible clarity, how many times you smiled when you should have been silent. How many times you explained yourself to people who had no intention of understanding you. How many times you stayed in rooms where you were subtly, consistently diminished and told yourself it was fine. That realization is not comfortable, but it is necessary, because you cannot begin to build something strong in yourself until you are willing to look honestly at what is weak. This is not about anger. It is not about becoming cold or hard or withdrawn from the world. What this is about, what the Stoics were really pointing to, is a kind of quiet, unshakable self-possession. The kind of person who does not need to react to every provocation. The kind of person who cannot be easily moved because they are rooted deeply in something that other people's opinions simply cannot reach. That person already exists inside you. But first, something has to die. Consider for a moment the people in your life who have treated you carelessly, not strangers. Strangers don't have the access required to wound you. Think about the ones who were close, the ones who interrupted you, dismissed your feelings, broke promises with barely an apology, or made you feel that your presence was conditional on your usefulness to them. Ask yourself this question honestly. Did it happen all at once? Or did it happen gradually, one small compromise at a time? Disrespect is rarely sudden. It is almost always incremental. It begins with a test, a minor overstep, barely perceptible, and it waits to see how you respond. If you absorb it quietly, the next test comes, and then another. Not necessarily because the other person is consciously malicious. Human beings are deeply instinctual creatures. We read the boundaries of others the way water reads the contours of terrain. We naturally flow toward whatever gives way. Epictetus, who was born a slave and who understood the mechanics of power better than most kings, said something that should stop you in your tracks. No man is free who is not master of himself. Notice what he did not say. He did not say freedom comes from other people treating you well. He said it comes from mastery of yourself. Because the moment you outsource your sense of dignity to how others behave toward you, you have already surrendered the only ground that matters. The disrespect you have received was often not an accident. It was a mirror. It reflected the gap between who you presented yourself to be and what you were actually willing to enforce. That is a difficult sentence to sit with, but sit with it anyway. When someone disrespects you, what is the first thing that happens inside you? There is usually a flash, a hot, immediate surge of feeling, anger, or perhaps something more wounded than anger. And then, almost immediately, something else activates. The calculation begins. Should I say something? Will it make things worse? Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe they didn't mean it that way. This negotiation, this internal committee that convenes every time someone crosses a line, is the weak version of yourself running the meeting. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his private journals, not for publication, but for his own psychological discipline, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He was a Roman emperor. He had armies at his command, and yet he wrote this to himself as a reminder. Because power over external events is an illusion that flatters us. The only sovereignty that is real is the sovereignty over our own interior. When you react from emotion, you are not exercising power. You are demonstrating vulnerability, not the healthy vulnerability of genuine connection. but the involuntary kind. The kind that tells people exactly which levers to pull to move you. And people, even people who love you, will pull those levers, often without knowing they are doing it. The Stoics called this prohairesis, the faculty of deliberate choice. It is the space between stimulus and response, and it is in that space that your character is built or abandoned. Every time you respond from impulse, you reinforce a pattern. Every time you pause and choose deliberately, you become someone slightly less controllable, slightly more whole. There is a misconception that must be addressed carefully here because it causes real damage. Many people hear emotional detachment and imagine a kind of emotional mutilation, becoming numb, closing off, building walls so high that nothing can enter. This is not what the Stoics meant, and it is not what psychological health looks like. Carl Jung, who spent a lifetime excavating the depths of the human psyche, understood that the parts of ourselves we suppress do not disappear. They go underground, they accumulate, and they return, usually at the worst possible moments, in the forms we least expect. Jung called this the shadow, the repressed weakness, the denied anger, the unfelt grief. And he said, with characteristic precision, that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Emotional detachment, as the Stoics practiced it, is not suppression. It is perspective. It is the ability to observe your own emotions the way a scientist observes a phenomenon, with interest, without being consumed. You feel the anger, you register the hurt, and then you ask, what is actually happening here? What does this feeling want me to know? And is the action it is urging me toward truly in my interest? This is the practice, not eliminating feeling, but refusing to be ruled by it. Seneca wrote to his friend Lucilius with a kind of urgent tenderness, retire into yourself as much as you can. He meant this not as isolation, but as the cultivation of an inner life so stable, so richly inhabited, that the turbulence outside loses its power to destabilize you. When your sense of self is located inside, not in validation, not in status, not in how others perceive you, then the opinions of others become genuinely, not performatively, less important. Here is something that almost no one talks about when they begin to change. When you stop tolerating what you used to tolerate, when you begin to enforce standards, when you become quieter and more self-contained, the people around you will not immediately respect it. In fact, something counterintuitive happens first. They push harder. In behavioral psychology, this is called an extinction burst. When a behavior that used to produce a result stops working, the initial response is not acceptance, it is escalation. The manipulation becomes more intense. The emotional appeals become more dramatic. The accusations come faster. You may be told you have changed, that you are cold, that you think you're better than everyone now. You may be guilt-tripped or tested in ways that are increasingly difficult to navigate with composure. This is the exact moment when most people collapse back into the old pattern, because it is exhausting to hold a new standard under pressure, because the guilt feels real, because somewhere the false hope whispers that if you just soften a little, if you just explain yourself one more time, they will finally understand. That hope is not kindness. It is a survival strategy your nervous system developed when you were young and dependent on the approval of others. It served you then. It is limiting you now. Killing false hope does not mean becoming cynical. It means becoming honest. It means accepting people as they have demonstrated themselves to be, rather than as you need them to be. Marcus Aurelius practiced this so deliberately that he wrote reminders to himself about specific individuals, noting their patterns, their limitations, their character, not with contempt, but with clarity. He chose his responses based on reality, not on hope or on fear. You are allowed to do the same. At the center of all of this is a question that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Who are you when no one is watching? Who are you when no one is approving? The weak version of yourself is, at its core, the version that cannot exist without external confirmation. It needs to be needed. It needs to be liked. It constantly adjusts, performs, shrinks, or inflates itself depending on the social atmosphere of the room it has just entered. It is exhausted, and it is deeply, invisibly lonely, because when you are always performing, no one ever actually meets you. Internal validation is not arrogance. Arrogance is also external. It is just approval seeking in reverse, requiring others to confirm your superiority rather than your likability. Internal validation is quieter than either of these. It is the capacity to evaluate your own behavior against your own values and find it acceptable, or, when it falls short, to correct it without theater. Epictetus again. Seek not that the things which happen should happen as you wish, but wish the things which happen to be as they are, and you will have a tranquil flow of life. The internal standard is sovereign. The internal standard does not shift depending on the mood of the room. This is the work, not building a persona that cannot be touched, but building a self so genuinely inhabited that the question of what others think becomes, in the most literal sense, secondary. As you begin to develop this internal stability, something subtle happens in your relationships and in your social world. You begin to notice, with an almost clinical precision, who energizes you and who depletes you, not because some people are good and others are bad, but because the energy exchange between people is real, and it is largely invisible until you become sensitive enough to feel it. You will find that certain people require you to constantly explain yourself. Every interaction involves a kind of negotiation for basic respect. Every conversation leaves you slightly dimmer than you arrived. These are not necessarily malicious people, but they are people whose relationship with you is built on a dynamic that no longer fits who you are becoming. The Stoics believed that we become like those we spend time with, not through imitation, but through immersion. The concerns, the values, the emotional habits of the people around you seep in quietly, the way dye seeps into fabric. Choosing your company carefully is not elitism. It is self-preservation of the most sophisticated kind. And here is what people do not expect. As you become more selective, as you become quieter and more grounded, as you stop chasing connection and stop performing for approval, you become, paradoxically, more magnetic. Not because you are trying to be, but because there is something deeply compelling about a person who does not need anything from you, who is genuinely present without being hungry, who listens without calculating, who speaks without performing. That quality, self-containment, genuine presence, inner stillness, cannot be faked. It has to be built. And the building of it requires exactly the process we have been walking through here. The title of this video is not metaphor for self-destruction. It is an invitation to transformation of the most precise kind. The weak version of you is not your enemy. It was, once, your protector. It learned to fawn when things were dangerous. It learned to appease. It learned to make itself invisible or agreeable in order to survive environments where strength was punished and compliance was rewarded. You developed these strategies for real reasons. They worked for a time, but you are not in that environment anymore. And the strategies that kept you safe in the past are now constructing a cage around you in the present. Carl Jung wrote that the creation of something new is not accomplished by the intellect alone, but by the play of instinct acting from inner necessity. The new version of you, the grounded, self-possessed, genuinely dignified version, does not emerge through force of will alone. It emerges through a series of honest confrontations with the old self, through moments where you choose, again and again, the more difficult but more truthful path. It is not a dramatic death. There is no moment of sudden transformation. It is quiet. It is slow. It is 1,000 small decisions to stop flinching, to stop apologizing for your existence, to stop explaining yourself to people who have already decided how to see you. One day you will notice that something is different. Not that life has become easier, it rarely does, but that you have become harder to move, harder to manipulate, harder to diminish. Not because you have built walls, but because you have built a foundation. Marcus Aurelius, on the most difficult days of his reign, managing war, plague, betrayal, the slow erosion of an empire, returned, again and again, to a single simple instruction he gave himself. Be like the rock against which the waves continually break. It stands firm, and the raging waters sink to rest around it. Not the rock that attacks the water. The rock that simply is. There is a form of dignity that has nothing to do with how others treat you. It exists prior to their behavior, and it persists after it. It is not earned by their approval, and it cannot be taken by their contempt. It is the quiet knowledge, maintained through daily practice and honest self-examination, that you have chosen to live in a manner consistent with your deepest values. That is the inner stability the Stoics were pointing toward. Not the absence of pain, not the elimination of difficulty, but an unbroken thread of self-respect that runs through every circumstance, every conversation, every loss. When you find that thread, and you will find it if you are willing to look, nothing outside you will have quite the same power over you again. That is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of it. If something in this resonated with you, not as motivation, but as recognition, I invite you to stay with it. Not to watch another video immediately, but to sit quietly for a few minutes and ask yourself which part of what you heard today applies most directly to your life right now. The work of building inner strength is not loud. It does not trend. It does not announce itself. It happens in the small, private moments where you choose once more to honor what you genuinely believe rather than what is simply easier. If you want to continue that work here, subscribe, not for content, but for the kind of conversation that takes the interior life seriously, and take care of yourself, deliberately,